see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch from the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy. And today I'm here with Professor Bridget Cooper. And Bridget is a professor of education at the University of Sunderland. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And you've been teaching for 31 years in the in adult education or in higher education. Is that...
No, I taught for about 15 years in schools and in adult literacy and numeracy, and then I've been teaching for about the last 16 or 17 years in higher education.
Oh, okay. And then you've also written this book here, which you kindly sent me a copy. It's Empathy in Education, Engagement, Values, and Achievement.
That's right, yes. Fairly recently published.
Yeah, and I see here, I'm just looking on the description of the book, and it says it's a thorough exploration of the role empathy plays in learning throughout all levels of education and its crucial relationship to motivation, values, development, and achievement. So this is, can you tell me a little bit about the book and kind of how you came about writing it?
Yeah. It's based a lot around my doctoral thesis, which was an exploration of empathy and values in education. So the book takes an awful lot from the thesis. And then in addition to that, it's got a whole series of chapters which also include lots of other research that I've done in education, and they take the ideas from the original research and expand them into various different areas, so education and technology and management of education, teacher training, those sorts of things. But the main thrust of the book is to describe, it's in three parts really. It's got the history of empathy and its role in education, and then the central part of the findings from my doctoral thesis, which is basically quite a detailed exposition of empathy in teaching and learning. And then the third part are all the other chapters which take the findings into various other areas. If is that sufficient?
Yeah, I have the outline here too, and I've read it, and it's a wonderful book. How did you come about to write it? What motivated you to write it?
Well, I did my thesis. I finished my thesis in 2002, and a lot of the research was done before then, and for many years while I've been lecturing and in my various roles in higher ed, I've had to write a lot of papers, but I've always wanted to write the book about all this investigation into empathy, and it's taken me a long time to find enough time to write it, but I wanted to explain the whole of the data. I mean, when you write a little paper for a journal, you can only explain small areas and small aspects, but when you take the time to write a book, obviously you can really explain it in real depth, and then you're hoping that people, you know, wherever they are, get a chance to read it and perhaps use their ideas in their research and perhaps think about, you know, in education, how it does really apply to education, because I think empathy is a massively important issue which we don't take enough stock of in education. I mean, generally emotional issues in education, you know, the world's not particularly good at understanding the complexity of it and how it really is central to all learning and development. And because empathy is a recognition of emotion and shared emotion and understanding other people's emotion, it enables you to learn much in a much deeper way, a much more effective way. And it demonstrates, a teacher who's got empathy demonstrates caring all the time. And that sort of caring attitude is the most effective way of developing children and of helping them to learn. So it not only develops their values, their own values, but it helps the whole process of learning. And I think if we were a bit better at providing the conditions in which empathy was able to flourish, we would see much faster learning, much more effective learning, and much more holistic learning in our schools.
Was there something that kind of was some kind of an insight you had that made you see the importance of empathy and want to, write a book about it? Was there maybe some inspiration?
Well, yes, I suppose there was really. When my original topic for my thesis was to look at values in education. And when you start to read about values and how they're formed and how children develop their values as they grow, all the writing, whatever sort of writing, the idea of empathy emerged in everything that I read, whether it was directly about empathy or whether it was more at a tangent. So all the time, whatever you were reading, the empathy seemed to sort of shine out of there as the key factor in values development. And we have a problem with the sort of kids who struggle to have developed values in their home environment for a whole variety of reasons. Their next, most important place in the world is school. And if we have time in school to support their values development, then we can really move them on and allow them to learn and to develop as whole people. And I think it became very clear to me as I went through the reading for my thesis that empathy was something that was just terribly important, which we weren't recognising in education. When I first started to ask teachers about it and to ask colleges of higher education about it and universities, the teachers thought it was very, very important. But when you look at teacher training, none of the teacher trainers really seem to be looking for empathy in their students or trying to particularly promote empathy. And it made me think that it was really a topic worth investigating. And I was very aware as well that I'd had a very a lovely childhood with lots of adult support and care, and that both brothers and sisters and parents. And I think you begin to realise that it's actually a really important part of all our lives and all our ways of communicating. And it makes us grow. It enables us to understand others and to share with others, and therefore we can grow in a much better and easier and wider way.
So it sounds like you were doing some research, and through your reading and through talking with teachers, you started seeing the importance of empathy, and that empathy, there wasn't kind of a focus on empathy in the training and so forth. So there's not like a spotlight kind of holding it up front and center. And so you decided to start kind of exploring the topic and bringing the material together, something like that?
Yes, I started to read very widely on it. And then for my PhD research, I wanted to research something that I thought teachers thought was important, because I've been a teacher all my life, and teachers they've got great commitment to what they do. They work incredibly hard, incredibly long hours, and they work with children every day, day in, day out. And I wanted it to be something that was important to them and that they found important. And so, because I'd read a lot about empathy, I did a sort of preliminary survey of a group of teachers who I had access to, and I gave them a sort of small ranking activity. I took lots of different characteristics from teacher training books and from books on effective teaching and what makes a good teacher, It was a long list of different attributes, and in there I inserted empathy, which, because it wasn't particularly made prominent in any of the teacher training literature. And when I gave them this activity, they put that as the first and most important thing on the list. And that made me think, well, yes, this, you know, I mean, I felt it was important for my own teaching, but I wanted, you know, I wanted to understand that other people thought it was important, whether teachers thought it was important, and they did. So then I had to sort of think, well, how am I going to investigate this? What can I do to find out more about it? And I'd asked in the teacher training colleges, and they didn't particularly see it as an important issue at that time. Of course, I think that has changed somewhat now. You know, because we've had a lot more emphasis on emotional intelligence and so on in the last 10 years, and I think that often brings in the idea of empathy. But of course, what I had to do was really try and find some methods of seeing how teachers used empathy in classrooms and what they thought about it. And so I did a sort of pilot study in a primary school, and I interviewed all the teachers, and I observed their lessons, and I interviewed about 12 children as well. And it became clear from that pilot study that the teachers did think it was important, and that they could talk about empathy in their teaching and why it was important. You could see it in the classrooms. You could see the things they talked about in the interviews. You could see them doing those things in the classrooms. And when you talk to the children, they knew a teacher who really understands them, which is what I suppose a teacher with empathy is. They knew what that teacher was like and what they did. I suppose I was trying to identify the behaviours that teachers show when they're demonstrating empathy, and why they're important to communication, learning, and the development of values. And the children were quite aware, even though they were quite young children, and the teachers were aware, and you could see these things happening. You could see where they were happening and where they weren't happening. And obviously then I was starting to get a handle on how I could do a bigger study than my initial pilot study.
Oh, so you're kind of, it sounds like there was maybe no big moment of inspiration, but just a slow kind of deepening interest in the empathy.
Yes. I mean, basically when I went in to observe the lessons, I had a sort of checklist of empathic features which I'd gleaned from the various readings that I'd done. And there was a lot of work in the States in the 60s and 70s by people like Aspie and Rogers on what makes on empathic teaching at that time. There was much more emphasis on it then, and there was all sorts of features of empathy, and I went into classrooms and looked for these, and I saw them, but I also saw lots more features. I mean, there's lots of ways in which a teacher can show empathy. I mean, a good example is in one lesson, the teacher, she was teaching a class of about 5 or 6 year olds, and she wanted a small group of the children to look at a sort of small blackboard with some points on it, and she set the blackboard up, and then she walked round to the back of the children and bent down to their level and looked to see if they could see the point she'd set up. Now, that wouldn't necessarily occur in any checklist, but you could see that immediately she was trying to see if the children could see what she wanted them to see. She needed to bend down to really have a good idea if from their position in the classroom they could see the things she wanted them to see. So lots of little things like that. You could see that an empathic teacher is trying all the time to make the lessons work for children, to understand the things from the children's perspective, and to make sure they can learn. So that was just one little incident. There were many, many things you could talk about. But it became clear that you could see these behaviours in classrooms. And so then I decided, because I'd found out quite a lot from the pilot, I then had to decide what my main study would be. And I think what I really wanted to know, what I seemed to find in the pilot, was that in some situations you could see a lot more empathy than others. So when I went into the main study, I wanted to know which situations, which contexts were more conducive to showing empathy than others. And I was quite happy with what the children had said, that children could identify this. And what I really wanted to know was what really empathic teachers think about teaching and learning and empathy, and in which context can you see that happening most effectively. Because in the primary school, I looked at all the teachers. I didn't select them for empathy, I just looked at every teacher. And in the main study, I decided to choose teachers who were chosen as empathic by their colleagues. So everybody that I observed and interviewed was selected for their empathy by either the head teachers that they worked for, or the colleges where they were training. I had some trainee teachers and some experienced teachers, and they were teaching from infants right through primary school, through secondary school, up to sixth form level. So it was quite a wide range, and it wasn't easy to get hold of teachers identified for their empathy. I went to 3 teacher training colleges for students who were considered empathic, and I went to about 7 or 8 schools to find teachers who were considered empathic. And that gave me a sort of small group in the end, who I then interviewed at length, maybe about 2 hours. And also I observed them several times in various lessons.
Well, from your studies, what have you found is the best way to, let's say, create a culture of empathy? Because that's kind of what my work is around, is looking at how do we create a culture of empathy, kind of at the largest scale for the whole country, the whole world, and you know, how do you do it in a school environment? How do you create a culture that's supportive and nurturing and that fosters empathy? So from your work, from your studies and research, what are the ways that you can help build a culture of empathy?
Well, I think what I discovered really was that there are different levels of empathy, and there's a sort of superficial empathy that we all use every day in interaction, where we listen to each other, we respond to each other, we smile, we look interested in what each other are doing, and that is the sort of beginnings of empathy.
So you're saying there's different levels of empathy, or?
Yes, there's the sort of basic interactional stuff that we all do in all our daily interactions that I called fundamental empathy. Because you've got to be able to do that even to start a relationship. You've got to be able to listen, you've got to be able to accept the other person and interact with them and be able to communicate with them. But then if you get a chance to communicate with somebody at length in intense interactions over time and with greater frequency, then you can develop, I suppose, what I call profound empathy. And this is where you develop a really rich mental model of the other person. And that's both affective and cognitive. They're not separate. When we think, we feel, basically. And this is what the neuroscience tells us. So we've got the chance when we want to, if we've got time and frequency, we can develop a much greater level of empathy. And what I found in the classroom observations, I found that the teachers all talked about empathy. They knew how important it was to learning. They knew how it helped to model values and to model caring. But when you actually went and watched what happened in the classrooms, it was very different. So some of the people that I watched were support teachers who worked one-to-one with children, and they worked maybe with special needs children or children with English as an additional language, and they worked one-to-one or in small groups. Now, in those lessons, you could see this profound empathy all the way through the lesson. The teacher had a great knowledge of the child, not just about their levels of learning, and they knew that, but they knew about their interests, they knew about their families, they knew everything about them, and they knew how they felt about all those things. This meant that they could integrate really high quality conversation and dialogue into every interaction with the child. And as a result, the levels of learning were very rapid and very high, and the quality of the relationship between the teacher and the child were really exceptional. And the teachers who were able to work in this way knew they were quite privileged, and that was a very powerful way of working. Now, most teachers try all the time to form relationships with children and to get those little one-to-one moments. But unfortunately, because we teach in large classes, those moments are quite rare. So what you see in a large class is something I call functional empathy, which was very, very different. It was more superficial. The teacher modelled all the lovely things you would like them to model, but they didn't have time to talk individually to children and to really move them on in lots of ways that they needed moving on. And instead of having a mental model of individuals, they tended to have a mental model of the class. And they interacted with the class a lot more and less with individuals. And so any individual in a class just gets seconds of time or moments of time. And these teachers were really exhausting themselves trying to find those moments because they knew how important they were. And so they would work in the corridors, they would catch children, in the dinner times, in the break times after school, in the entrances and exits to lessons, to try and have a little bit of individual one-to-one time with a child. But in fact, for example, in secondary schools, they might be working with 500 children in a week. And that made a lot of difference to the quality of empathy that they could show to any individual child. So I suppose what we would be looking to do in schools, what I would want to do in schools, is to find opportunities for one-to-one interaction or small group interaction at an early stage in a teacher-pupil relationship, so that the teacher gets to know the child more individually, gets to know their sensitivities, the things they like, the things they don't like, gets to know the levels of learning, the things they don't do and don't understand. And then I think if you can get that quite early in a relationship, then the larger classes work a lot better. And so I think we need to find ways in our schools of not assuming that a large class of 30 is a good place to be and to work. We do really need smaller classrooms and opportunities early in teachers' relationships with children to form deeper and more higher quality relationships, rather than this management by numbers. Because whenever you treat people as a number as opposed to a real human person, that's when you develop the sort of alienation and disaffection. And we see that a lot in schools, and we don't want that for children, and we don't want it for teachers, because it makes life very hard for teachers as well as for children. And I think if we want to develop a culture of empathy in our schools, we have to really think about how we organise them, and about creating classrooms where teachers have time to get to know children and children have time to get to know teachers as human beings as opposed to teachers. Because one of the things the children said in the pilot was that a teacher who understands you doesn't behave like a teacher. And I think that's quite an interesting comment, because what she was saying, she's more like any other person. She treats me like any other person, not like a teacher. So we need less management and more quality interaction, I think. And that applies to the head teachers as well. So you would have to organise schools in a more human way. And the head teachers in the same way, if they've too many staff, if they've too many responsibilities, they can't find time for people either. And the exam systems we have and the assessment systems are very much driven by numbers, not by child development. So we need to make radical changes, I think, in our education systems if we're going to create a culture of empathy. And the good thing is that all teachers, not all teachers, but most teachers, are absolutely got tons of empathy. They are very good at empathising, but we need to give them the conditions in which to work, in which that empathy can flourish, I would say. And that's certainly what my findings suggested. We need to think about how we organise schools and how we enable this high quality interaction to take place.
Yeah, so if we want a culture of empathy, it seems to me like the first thing we need to do is set it out as a cultural value and have a vision for it. And say,
Yes.
This is what we want to do. Here's our vision for how we want, of what it is that we're wanting. And how do we work towards that? So it's almost like the vision maybe comes first, so we can start working towards it. And how does that resonate? The idea of a vision.
Yeah, I think you do need a vision, and you need to understand. That vision needs to relate to everything we know about teaching and learning. I mean, we know a lot about teaching and learning in schools. But we're not terribly good on the emotional side and on the affective side. We don't understand how powerful empathy is in learning. And I think, it's not just in learning, it's also in homes, in workplaces, in society generally. The same empathy applies in nursing, in the care of the elderly, in the way a boss treats his workers. And we need to understand it in its depth, I think. So we need a vision, but I think we need to understand why it's important. And because you can't have a vision unless you understand why it's important.
Yeah, it's like how do we get to the vision? It's why do people want? I mean, they need to have some kind of a buy-in for that vision. It's like, how is it going to affect them? How is it going to make their life better and enrich their life or enrich the life of their children? And what would you say to that? Like, how is the intention? How do we create that intention within people to want to build that culture of empathy?
Yeah. Well, I think, we do, I think a lot of people do understand its importance intuitively, but what they probably don't understand is the real significance of empathy, and perhaps see it as just something that is nice or desirable. But what they need to understand is that it's essential, really, both for the development of their children, but also for society as a whole. And I think that's the issue that we need to explain, is how central it is to all human development and societal development. Now we've got a lot of problems, really, because we're driven all the time by the finance motive. And if you're driven by finance, you tend to put people second. And being able to put people and human development first seems to me to be the important thing. So worry less about you know, numbers and how much things cost as to the longer term. If you invest at an early stage in developing empathy in children and in adults, then you're going to get real long-term benefits. But if you neglect it, then you will suffer the consequences. And I think we do continually suffer the consequences. So I suppose it's how do we convince people? I think that's the question. And I think we need to show them examples of how, you know, how empathy does work, and where it works, and how it works, and what it does. And I think that involves will involve quite a lot of research, because I don't think there's been enough research done on this in any way, really.
So when you're talking about empathy, it sounds like you're talking about seeing, it's for example, the teacher seeing the real picture of the student. It's like, what is the kind of the dynamics, the emotional dynamics that's going on in that student's life, and having kind of a deeper picture of it, and it,
yeah,
right, it's like feeling it, you know, having the cognitive empathy, you know, the perspective taking, as well as feeling what the student is going through, and feeling that more deeply, you know, having a deeper understanding of them.
Yes.
Is that how you kind of define empathy? Is that connection?
Yes, it is. It's when you have a very profound understanding of a person, and that involves all aspects of their life, really. And you know, when children have got problems or worries, they tend to hide them, or they act out. And you know, an empathic teacher sees this, and they start to understand that they're either being defensive or they're acting out for certain reasons. And once they get beyond that and into the real issues that the child is concerned about, then that's when learning happens, because the child stops being defensive and you know, retracting into itself, and actually feels understood, feels valued, feels, well, somebody else around here knows how I feel about this and understands my position. And that enables them then to open up to communicate, and that enables learning. And it's this depth of understanding about individuals which seems to make the difference, really. And these teachers all understood that. They seem to understand that quite implicitly in everything they did. And so if a teacher can get to know a child well, the child simply moves on and develops much more quickly. If they don't, then it's very hard for that child to move on. And it's the same for parents. You know, if parents can interact deeply with their children and converse with them and play with them and do things with them and interact all the time with them, they know about their child. They know their child very well, and that enables their child to grow and to develop. But if we use a sort of approach which glosses over the individual, then we don't allow them to develop. And our schools sometimes appear to be more like factories than places of human interaction. I mean, we know from special needs children, you know, that if you want to develop a child who's got massive problems, complications, that this intensive interaction is the one way to move them on. That they, you know, one-to-one, very intense work with a caring adult is the most powerful way to move them on. And, you know, we know it, and we know it in little pockets here and there and everywhere, but we haven't got any large studies or very extensive studies which show these things. And I think we need to do we need more research, really, to show the impact of empathy on children and on adults too. I mean, it's everybody, really.
There is a project in the United States, in North America, with the organization Ashoka, and they're kind of a social entrepreneur organization, and they're working towards the vision of teaching empathy in all schools. So it feels like there is a movement building in this direction. Yes. So
I think it's true. I think certainly, well, I mean, in the UK over the last sort of 10 years, we've taken on board a lot more the importance of emotional and affective issues in learning, and I think teachers have always known it, but actually governments have started to recognise it and see it as something that needs to be done. However, you know, governments are very cyclical, and, you know, initiatives in education sort of come and go quite quickly. So I think there is a movement, and there is a much greater understanding of the importance of emotion in learning. I think the neuroscientists have really done a lot for us in this regard, because they have identified this and confirmed a lot of the old psychological theory on the importance of affect in learning. And so that, you know, we do know scientifically more about how the brain works and how interaction takes place and what happens when interaction takes place. And we've got to convert this into practical advice for teachers and schools. But I think what we all live with, and it's a shame really, because it impacts us. We live with the sort of Victorian school system, and we don't really think carefully about how can we change this. And the main reason we don't change it is because it costs a lot of money to make classes smaller or to give one-to-one interaction. And yet every piece of research that looks into, if you're looking at reading, for example, all the reading schemes where children get a little bit of one-to-one support, we all know it transforms their ability to read. But at the end of the day, you know, governments take away the money for those schemes. They come in, they have an initiative, we know it works, and then it fades as, you know, a recession hits or whatever. But what we do know is that the 1 to 30 ratio is really not particularly helpful for learning, and we use that for financial reasons, not because it's a good way of learning. So I think we need to, you know, it's about getting the message out. How does learning happen? You know, what encourages learning? What supports a holistic development in children? And I think that worldwide we are more aware of emotion and how important it is in the whole way we live and act and behave. But we don't want to let financial pressures stop us recognising that. And we need to understand how, you know, numbers play a big part. I think it's mathematical, I suppose, at base. When you talk about empathy, you wouldn't think of it as being something mathematical, but I think it is. I think it's the quality and intensity of interaction, and that, you know, that involves time, which is numerical. It involves people, which, you know, are numerical in the sense the more time you have with more empathic adults, the more likely you are to develop empathy as a child, and to grow with that, and to be able to show it to others.
Yeah. So you were kind of talking about maybe some of the obstacles to creating empathy, and you mentioned the money, finances, you know, paying for the time, and then also something about the Victorian model. What is that model that you see as kind of like an obstacle there?
Well, since we started schooling, we've always had a large class and one teacher. So, you know, in some parts of the world, it's more than 1 to 30. In some schools in England, it's more than 1 to 30. It's a very old-fashioned model where, when we first started taking children to school, we put a teacher in front of them and we sit, you know, 40 children in the classroom. And that way it's cheap, because, you know, one teacher, 40 children, the teacher's, you know, obviously trying to teach them in a very what we call a transmission model, where the teacher says things and the children listen. But what we know about learning and empathy is it is at its best when there is dialogue, when there is interaction, when there's conversation. So one of the ways we know about that, so one of the ways we've got around that in recent years, we still have the 1 to 30 classroom, but we get the children talking to each other more, and we get them doing group work and so on, and that does help to some extent. But what certainly from some of my other research has showed is that the quality of learning and the quality of empathy is much greater when you've got an experienced adult working with a child than you have if you have another child working with a child, because obviously they're still in the stages of development, and it's much easier for an adult to show real empathy than it is for a little child. So putting children into groups can be quite useful, but it's also limited, and we need to move from that Victorian model of 1 to 30 or 1 to 40. We need to move to small classes, and we need to build in human interaction early into relationships. So let's say for the first 2 days of a term, instead of the teacher meeting the whole class, maybe she has a quarter of an hour with each child. Maybe she takes a little bit of time with each individual member just to chat to them, get to know them, build up that more human interaction before moving into larger groups, because it's the intensity of interaction that makes the difference there, I think. So all I mean by the Victorian model is that, in order to have cheap schooling, we've always had large classes, really. And we tinker around with curriculum, and we tinker around with teacher training. But that has minimal difference, because what we need is better quality interaction. And that comes through smaller groups, really. Which is why, rich people pay for private education where there are smaller classes. I mean, that's what they're paying for, really. Whether they know what they're paying for, they know that their children get more adult interaction in those classes.
So it's really that one-to-one interaction and that one-to-one dialogue and back and forth and that time that we're needing for promoting empathy.
Yes, I think that's the. I mean, in my book, the explanation of profound empathy is all about that. It's the one-to-one dialogue and interaction, in which you listen and then you speak and then you listen and then you feel. It's a sort of constant human dialogue, and that's how we learn. And we know from learning theory that's how we learn, but we don't give our children those chances in school. So we need to make schools, redesign the way we work in order to provide that. And it's most, parents need to do it with their children, and a lot of parents do it with their children. But if that's the only place they get it, they need that quality both in school and later in work too, I think. Because institutions and work organisations that treat their workforce as numbers, then they have the same sort of effects as we do if we treat children as numbers in schools. People get very disaffected, their morale drops, and it doesn't take much, actually. Sometimes people just need a kind word or a smile. Those sort of things are really important. And sometimes we're all so busy and driven that we forget that it's the human interaction that makes us all work more smoothly, get along better, more productive, we learn faster. And really, it's not just for schools. It is for business too. I think there is been quite a lot of work done on, since Goleman's book on emotional intelligence and so on, there's been a lot of work done on emotionally sensitive workplaces and managers and so on. And, if we want to thrive, our society and people to thrive, then we need to be very human in the way we interact.
Well, where I'm coming from is that we need to develop like a social support for that. So if we want empathy within the schools, we're going to need the larger social kind of a movement to do that.
Yeah.
So if we can kind of get the researchers, the academics, the scientists, and then the social activists, maybe the policymakers, kind of move it and to raise empathy within society, so that empathy is kind of in the United States. It's like you hear people talking over and over again about freedom. We need freedom. We need freedom. So it's like this. I don't know what it is in the UK where you are. What the big values are that they talk about. But it seems to me it needs to be moved to that level within society to. Just out of curiosity, what are the big values always mentioned in the UK?
Interesting. Well, I don't know. It depends who you talk to for that, really. I think we appreciate our freedom. I think we appreciate our tolerance. I think that's quite a big value in the UK. I think we are generally a pretty tolerant society. And so you might say, well, that's the sign that we are developing empathy in some ways. And I think we are, but I think all sorts of things militate against it as well. So as soon as you bring in a more sort of aggressive, competitive environment, I think that destroys empathy. And so all the time, you're trying to avoid those high levels of aggression and competition. Which I think just really don't help, because in order to win, somebody else has to lose, and at that point you are obviously not showing them any empathy, because what we would like is for us all to do well and for us all to develop in lots of different ways and complex ways. So I think we do feel here we're tolerant as a society, and I suppose that's quite a good place to start when you're just discussing empathy, because it's a vital part of tolerance. But I think it's very difficult because the people who dominate the discussion are the media and the politicians, obviously, and they tend to be more competitive and more aggressive, really, in their approach, which makes it harder. It makes it harder for the sort of human values to bubble through. But I think it is moving. I do think things are changing quite a lot, and I think we can keep insisting on raising the profile of emotions and affect in learning. I do it all the time anyway. I try and do it all the time, and but it is. I think one of the problems we've got, and you'll probably encounter this too, is that if you talk about empathy, people think you mean something that is very sort of woolly. It's a woolly. It's emotional and it's soft and it's woolly. But actually, when you read about it and you see it in action, it's a very strong and very powerful quality, which is really, really important. And I suppose as well, it's always been considered it's been considered a more feminine, quality. But in fact, it isn't. It isn't a feminine quality. It's a human quality. And I think sometimes, the very traditional macho approach is to say, oh, that's just that sort of woolly, girly female stuff. But actually, people who work in caring services and people who work well with other people, they know how powerful that quality is. And I think it is there. We do know more about it and we do appreciate it more. But we need to keep talking about it, and to make it clear when we talk about empathy that it's not a woolly quality. It's not just something that's nice. It's something very, very powerful and very, very creative and very, very empowering for people. And that's what we need to get over, I think. Because I know if I talk about, I know I've talked about emotions and affect and empathy in some of my, I've worked in quite a few universities, and sometimes people look at me thinking, oh, well, she's just, she's just a bit soft or woolly. But it's actually a very powerful quality, and that's what we need to get over.
Yeah, it's like people are kind of demeaning empathy by just saying, oh, that's, yeah, I guess woolly, we don't have that term, but I can kind of imagine kind of a cardigan, right? A sweater, a big furry, fluffy,
Yes.
It's just, I'm just imagining that's what it is. It's, here it's also like it's weak. Somehow you're weak if you have empathy, and
That's right.
you have to really be tough. You've got to close yourself off from others and bang them over the head or something.
That's right.
That's what strength is being able to bang someone else over the head, or
Yes. Yeah. And it's all really empathy, is described as a soft skill, isn't it? But actually it's a strong skill, and although it's not an aggressive sort of, power sort of thing, it is very, very powerful, and it's about getting below the surface and getting below the sort of superficialities and the obvious things, and understanding what sort of qualities really help us to function as human beings in all our various ways.
Yeah, I think to be empathic, you have to be very grounded.
Yeah.
You have to be, there's a certain strength there of maybe character or of spirit, because to be open to others, to have the space for others, you can't be fearful. If you're fearful and closed off, you're not going to have that openness to take in others, and to have the strength and capacity to kind of be present with it, with fear.
That's right. Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's usually weaker people who are frightened of losing face, or frightened of anybody else's different ideas threatening theirs, and they're actually weaker people. But in order to hide that, they put up defences of aggression and so on. But to be empathic and to have time for other people, you have to be very confident, and you have to be prepared to forget about yourself, and listen and care about somebody else for the time being, rather than yourself. I mean, it's about making the other person, seeing them as important, more important than yourself at that time that you're with them. And doing that, you have to be quite strong. Of course, some people do find, that, and I suppose these empathic teachers that I interviewed, they were giving of themselves all the time. And I think you have to be careful, because you can just exhaust yourself and burn yourself out by doing that. And so they have to also care for themselves. That's quite important. And I think, as well, that in institutions and organisations, we need to realise how much caring takes out of people, and to be aware that it can be quite exhausting, caring for lots of people. And even caring for small amounts of people, if they need a lot of support and care, that is a very tiring thing as well.
Did you look at empathy for teachers? Like I kind of sometimes I think of empathy like a battery. You get a charge, and as a teacher, the teachers need to have space and time for others to empathize with them, or
That's true, yeah.
And how, is that something you looked at as well?
It is. It is. Well, I wasn't specifically looking at it, but it came out in the interview. So teachers who felt that they were working in schools where the heads were very empathetic, that really helped them too. I mean, it was a very powerful motivating factor for them. If they felt that they were understood and valued and cared for, and they were encouraged to learn and develop, that really helped them in their job. If they had a head who was less empathetic, who sort of locked himself away in his office and doesn't have anything to do with the staff and didn't understand the sort of problems they were having, they found that very demotivating, and it made it harder, much harder for them. And in those situations, teachers sometimes leave the profession because they need that support, just like the students need the support. So, and the other thing was in teacher training too, you know, although in teacher training, the lecturers, again, are probably very empathetic people, but they work with huge numbers of students, and, you know, they might have lectures with 500 students in them. They might have seminars with over 30 students in them. And again, they can't model empathy to their student teachers, so that student teachers understand that they need to model it to their students. And I think in universities, it is also a problem that we have too many students to any given staff member. And also, you know, increasingly universities in the UK, I mean, obviously it's very different in America. I don't know how you find it, but we have very, we're growing, you know, it's increasingly becoming a very sort of tough financial market. And that drives down staff numbers and drives up student numbers.
Well, we've gone for about an hour, and I feel like we could talk for hours, kind of. And I would actually like to explore more about the your book. You know, kind of maybe go through some of the chapters of what you. So perhaps we could have another dialogue at some point, and also looking to have some panel discussions. And would love to have you take part in one of those, where we can get together with some other, you know, perhaps teachers or whatever, and kind of continue this dialogue. But I think one of the ways to build a culture of empathy is to dialogue about it, and just to kind of keep bringing it up, keep talking about it. And so I really appreciate you know, taking the time to, you know, share your stories and insights and your research, you know, this wonderful research that you've done.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure, actually. I would like to share it more. I mean, again, you know, you work in jobs where you're just so busy most of the time, you don't get time to talk about it in any depth. Although, for example, I did go and talk about it to lots of head teachers recently, and shared my work with them, and they were very interested. I think, but for them, the problem is that they have inspections and government policy, and all that tends to dictate a way of working and a way of behaving which isn't very conducive to empathy. But when you talk to teachers about it, and head teachers, they know it's important. They're very aware that it's important. So I think we've got a chance of raising the profile. So shall we arrange another time?
Yes, I'll stop the recording right here.
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.